Well, hi Warriors, welcome back. Today we have another Facebook find, Waterfall dresser. We believe this dresser is around 80 years old or so, maybe 80 to 100. The people we got it from said it had been in their family for 4 generations, so that's kind of how we're dating it. But we got some real interesting things with this. The hardware is one of the things that really got us on this. It's really unique hardware that we've just never seen before. And we're not sure if that's paint on there. We're not sure. So we have to do some testing and try to figure out what the heck is on this hardware. In any case, we have some laminate that's gone. On the top back corner, we've got laminate that's peeling, and it even looks like the underlayment is warped and peeling. So we're gonna have to do something with that. And we've got a kind of an if then that list. If one thing works, then we'll go this way, and if it doesn't work, then we'll try the next thing, and if that works, then we'll do this. So we really have no idea what we're gonna end up with on this dresser. So why don't you stick with us? We'll find out together what we end up with. Welcome to our channel. I'm Jim, and this is my wife Cindy. We find old, outdated, used, and sometimes abused furniture like this and turn it into this. Join us on our journey of furniture makeovers. So the first thing we have to do, as with any piece of furniture we start with, is making sure we give it a good cleaning and removing all the hardware. So we're cleaning our piece with crud cutter to spray on and wipe off. After we're done, however, we want to make sure that we rinse the whole unit off with a damp cloth, rinsing well with water and rinsing the cloth out and wiping it all down. Make sure we get rid of any residue that's left from the crud cutter so we don't have any adhesion problems with the paint later. So when we did our rinse with the water and rinsing it out in the rag, I want you to notice the water. And you see how the water is not really muddy, but it's more like tinted. It's still clear. It just has kind of a brown look to it. That is actually what we call bleeding. That is from the stain. And when you hear people talk about a piece of furniture that bleeds, that is what they're talking about. That's actually the stain starting to come off, and it's getting into the water, and that will also bleed through your paint. We'll show you an example of that later on. So the hardware presented us with a little bit of a challenge. We weren't quite sure what we were going to do with it. These little plastic pieces are actually Bakelite, which they don't make anymore. It was kind of the first commercially made plastic way back when. We wanted to have a little bit of shine on that Bakelite. Generally it doesn't shine much, but we wanted to see if we could put a little shine on it. So we put a little bit of Howard's feed and wax on it. It did shine it up, but in the end that really wasn't what we wanted. And with the hardware itself, we tried cleaning with crud cutter, and that didn't quite do what we wanted. So then we tried using some Brasso. After the Brasso sat on there for a while and we wiped it off, really didn't like the way it looked still. So then we went ahead and we tried some vinegar and water, and the vinegar and water worked a little too well. As you can see, it took the finish right off it. So We decided that we were going to go ahead and continue taking the finish off as best we could, and then we would go ahead and paint. We were going to try the Dixie Belle Moonshine Metallics in Gold Digger color and actually paint them in gold. And then later on, after those are dry, we're going to see what we can do about sealing them up. But the Gold Digger really came out well on these pieces once we put a couple coats on. Really like the way they came out. So we're using Titebond to fix some of the laminate. And when you use a wood glue to fix laminate, or glue any wood together really, you want to make sure that you saturate it. You can never have too much glue. Even if it starts dripping down the sides like here. You can just use a wet paper towel or a wet cloth and wipe it right off when it's wet. It's not a big deal. But you want to make sure that you have plenty of glue stuck in there where the pieces are loose so that they adhere very well. You want to make sure you got complete coverage in there. And the way to tell you have enough glue in there is when you push on it or squeeze it, the glue starts oozing out. Now we're going to be using this board to get even pressure all the way across the dresser along that laminate with a clamp on either side. What you see us using there is parchment paper, and this can really be your friend when you're using glue. If I were to put that board on there and clamp this down, the glue would squeeze out from my joint and it would literally glue the board right to the dresser, and we'd be tearing laminate off when we try to get that board off. So anytime you need to glue something, even if you're just going to use your clamp, it's not a bad idea to put a piece of parchment paper in between your clamp and the surface you're gluing. That way you don't glue your clamp to the surface either. So, and here you see I'm doing it on both sides. That way the clamp is protected as well as the board, so that nothing gets glued to the wood that shouldn't. So after we let that dry for I think about 3 hours, went ahead and took our clamps off, and you're going to see here the advantage of using that parchment paper. As soon as I get this clamp off, we'll remove the board, and you'll see how the parchment paper just doesn't stick to the glue. You can see the marks where the glue was squished out, and it just comes right off. And then whatever glue is left on your surface you can just sand, but that way you never end up with inadvertently gluing things to your surface that you weren't intending to. Finally, time to do some sanding, and at this point we kind of already have a design in mind of what we want to use. We kind of considered where the repairs were that we needed to make, because we're not going to be able to have just natural wood where those repairs are. So we kind of came up with a design. You're going to see that in a few minutes here. But for sanding this down, we have to go through the shellac coating that's on here, which is what they used back then to seal stained wood with. And then we want to get down through the stain as much as we can without getting through the laminate itself. So we're only using a 120 grit sandpaper, just taking our time, getting this all sanded down. And you'll notice we're not doing the edges of the drawers other than a scuff sand on either end. And that's simply because we're going to be painting the ends of those drawers. And here you'll see we're doing where we glued, and then we use some Dixie Belle Mud to take care of areas where laminate was missing and get those all filled in so we can get those sanded down. This is the side of the dresser, and you'll notice I'm actually going against the grain with my orbital sander. The reason I'm doing this is to get through that shellac that's on there. So I'm actually not even getting down to the wood yet on this first pass. After I kind of ate through the shellac, then I went back and I went with the grain to actually get down a little bit further. But mainly this was just a scuff sand so our paint would adhere. I really wasn't trying to get down to the wood necessarily on this portion of the dresser. And this is always super fun on some of these older pieces. I want to maintain the integrity of the curve that they have this laminate on. So I actually started hand sanding. And again, I'm going against the grain just to get through that initial shellac coating that's on there. And then I come back and I go with the grain to smooth it all out. We don't want to go too deep against the grain. Then we have big scratches that we need to deal with. So it was just basically to get down through that shellac coating. And then once we started hitting wood, then I started going with the grain. I just worked my way across, and then we did that flat spot with our orbital sander again. So I wanted to show you guys what we mean when we call a piece of furniture a bleeder. This is the Dixie Belle Mud that we applied, and you can see the brown stain that's in it. That's actually the stain from the furniture bleeding through into the Dixie Belle Mud. And this will happen with your lighter color paints also. Darker colors, it can happen. So I tend to prime regardless if I know that a piece of furniture is a bleeder. But that's just the stain that bleeds through into your new coat of whatever you're putting on. And that's the reason why we prime, in order to block that stain from doing that. Finally, we get to do some measuring, figure out where we're going to lay our tape for our paint, and we'll start getting it all taped up and ready to go so we can start doing our priming and painting. So while I was finishing up the priming, Cindy was over at the table and she was finishing putting the gold digger from Dixie Belle on our hardware to get that all completed. Once the primer had dried, I wanted to give it a nice smooth texture. So in order to do that, I went over it. I'm only using a 320 grit sandpaper on my orbital for this. The primer tends to smooth out very easily, very quickly. So I used a very fine grit sandpaper to smooth this out. After getting all the primer smoothed out, I put the tape back down so that we could apply our paint. And I put the tape just barely to the outside, just a smidgen, if you know what a smidgen is. It's a saying my dad always used to use, was smidgen. So I put it just a smidgen outside of the primer so that we would not see any white when we applied the paint. We wouldn't see the primer showing from underneath it. And here's the color paint we're using. This is Dixie Belle's Chalk Mineral Paint. The name of the color is In the Navy. So when I applied the first coat, if you noticed, I used my Mr. bottle occasionally, and that was just to make sure that the paint stayed a little bit thinner and a little more fluid, and it prevents a lot of brush marks. Moving on to the second coat, I always like to roll when I can. It gives me a very flat and level finish. When I use the roller, it's just something I prefer. A lot of people do very well with a brush. I just tend to feel like I do better with the roller. After putting all the drawers back in place, it was time to seal our unit, and we decided to try something new to us this time. We decided, since we were doing the wood and the chalk mineral paint, that we were going to use Dixie Belle's Howdy hemp oil, and we were going to seal it with the hemp oil. Basically, you just brush it on, get a coating on there. It doesn't have to be very thick, you just want to spread it out so everything's covered. And then after everything's on, then you can come back after it sits for a little bit, maybe an hour or so. You want to come back and you want to wipe everything down, get all the excess oil off, and then you may have to come back again later on if you notice that it's pooling or it still looks oily somewhere. You want to wipe it down again. Sometimes it may take a couple of times, maybe 3 times to wipe it down. But we just loved how this hemp oil enhanced the chalk paint, gave it a much deeper color. And you can see right here how it enhances the grain of the wood and the great color that it gives it. So now we're going to wipe down and just remove all the excess oil. And one of the kind of bonuses for us, really unexpected, that bar that runs across between the second and third drawer. It's a different type of wood, so when we put the hemp oil on it, it actually almost turned it gold, which really looks cool with this dresser. And that was just a very lucky thing for us that happened. And finally, it's time to put some hardware on. And there it is. So let's go ahead and get this staged, and we'll take a look at it, see how it looks. Okay, so just a quick rundown on the numbers. We bought this from Facebook Marketplace for $20, and we have about $25 or so in materials, and paints and whatnot. We're listing it on Facebook Marketplace for $285. So with the $45 in cost that we're in on this, we have a potential profit of about $240. As always, thanks for watching, and have a flippin' awesome day.